This Choircast podcast episode is brought to you by my book, Breaking Bad Faith, Exposing Myth and Violence in Popular Theology to Recover the Path of Peace. I'm Michael Camp. The book helps people break damaging beliefs that are based on myths. It exposes the big lie that God brings justice through retribution, punishment, imprisonment, the death penalty, lenient gun laws, American wars, final judgment, and eternal damnation. Find it at Amazon.com.
All right, everybody. Welcome to, I think, what's going to be season 8 of the Jonathan_Foster podcast. And we're going to have a lot of fun this season because we're going to spend several episodes talking about your favorite theology and my favorite theology, open and relational theology. Sometimes we call it process. Sometimes we call it open and relational. Maybe, Andrew, sometimes I call it ORT rather than process because process is kind of pejorative for the crowd that I come from.
That's unfortunate.
I know, it's stupid, but it's kind of the way it is. Either way, I've got my good friend, Dr. Andrew Davis, with us today. We're going to get to him in just a moment. But just want to encourage everyone, if you want to find out more about what I'm up to, check out jonathanfosteronline.com. As you probably know, if you've listened to the show, I've got a few books out, including my most recent, which is very much an open and relational theological kind of foray into grief and loss and beauty and art called Indigo, the Color of Grief. And that's been going really well. So thanks for all of you for helping make that happen and reviewing it and participating in all of that. And lots of other good stuff happening. And I'll put some stuff in the show notes. But Andrew, it's great to have you today. Here's a quick introduction. Andrew is a program director at the Center for Process Studies. He's got a bunch of degrees, and he can list all of them if you want. He's authored a bunch of books and papers, including his most recent that we kind of got to work together on. Not that I added content, but we got to work together on a little bit through Sacred Press called Metaphysics of Exolife. So if any of you listeners out there are interested in the possibility, in the dare we even say the potential of extraterrestrial life out there, you should get a hold of Andrew's book. The thing I appreciate most about Andrew, well, besides his friendship, is his YouTube channel. And I think I've told you before, but I've checked that thing out many times. I'm really kind of a noob into process and Whitehead stuff. I never read Whitehead. It's slightly embarrassing to say until probably 2019, maybe. So when I jumped into this thing with Tom, doing this dissertation on Girard and ORT, I was like, just dive into the deep end. So I dialed up your YouTube videos multiple times, fell asleep more than once, not because they were boring, but because I was
hopefully my voice is comforting too.
Yeah, because your voice was comforting and because literally, I do think this is the truth. I was processing so much information. I think your brain sometimes just goes, it just shuts down, man. So anyhow,
I get it.
Thanks for all that you do. You're genuinely like on a short list of scholars, open and relational process, Whiteheadean people around the world. And thanks for carving time out to be with us today.
I appreciate it, Jonathan. Yeah, thank you very much for those kind comments and for your help on Metaphysics of Exolife. You were very helpful on the back end, certainly. And I wouldn't feel too bad about not reading much Whitehead. You have many trained PhD philosophers today who've never read Whitehead. So if you've read a little bit, you're already perhaps ahead of them.
Well, and he's just one of those people, right, where you wind up spending more time reading people who have read Whitehead and than you do actually him. I mean, I have read him, but it's tough, man.
It is. Well, that's a good place to start, though. Reading the secondary literature is a great place to start. And when you have a handle on some of that, then you can start to dip into Whitehead.
Right.
Whitehead read a page of Hegel and put it down. Many today would say this is terrible, but Hegel's also in the water, so it's sort of he got it influenced by him. But he'll even say the amount of philosophy he hasn't read as opposed to the philosophy he has read is, this is very monumental. So I wouldn't feel too bad.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you for making me feel better. Well, so as you and I talked about, what I thought I might do, as I already mentioned, we're going to do several episodes on open and relational theology. And I thought this might be a really good way to start this season because I heard you speak. It's been almost 2 years ago now, not quite, but at OrtCon out in Wyoming. And that thing has been stuck in my mind for a year and a half. I took a bunch of screenshots back earlier this week. I pulled them up they're still on my phone. But
Great.
you talked about 10 transitions that day that I thought were super helpful. And so as we think about, maybe this is a good way to frame it. If it's not, you can fix it, reframe it for us. But
Sure.
as we think about why do we need open and relational theology in our day and age? Well, here are 10 reasons, 10 transitions that are happening, in fact, probably have already happened in our society that opens us up to the need for moving in this direction so that, and of course, my emphasis is a little bit more theology, but opens us up to a more expansive theology. Would that be a fair way to kind of frame this?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, as we think we live, says Whitehead, right? So there's this sense in which ideas, theory implicates and flows into our practice. And when our ideas begin to change, presumably our practice begins to change too. So definitely. And I love these transitions. I've been thinking through them, over the last couple of years as well. And they're not just theological, there's an existential dimension to them too. So the sense in which making these transitions impacts how we think about ourselves, our existence, and how we relate to the world. But as well, our thinking about God, right? How we think about God, how we live and move and have a relation to God. So these ideas, I think, are very important. And there's a precedent for this that runs all the way back to the philosophical depths of the tradition. Socrates, for example, I think of his famous statement, the unexamined life is not worth living, right? And that's a great statement, but we should also flip it around. We should invert it and say the unlived life is not worth examining, right? So we have this task in the philosophical endeavor where our examination and our living comes together. And if we fall to either side of that, if we overly examine our life and neglect to live it, right? This is the critique of the armchair sort of approach to philosophy. We're so heavenly minded, we're no earthly good, right? We might say that of some theologians as well. But if all we do is live indulgently without examining our life on the other end, we're also going to fall into a pit in that regard. So there's this beautiful tension, I think, in the tradition philosophically, where philosophy should be a guide for living. It should be practical. And I think process thinkers, open relational thinkers in particular, have a set of ideas based not just on Whitehead, but others that allow certain transitions to take place. And to live it out practically should be a goal of ours and not just contemplating it theoretically. So I'm trying to do that, at least in part, even though I love the theory, you know that about.
Right. No, that's really good. And I would add to that, just to take off what you're saying. Yeah, scientifically, these things are already transitioning and changing. And so, in a social way, in a very real cultural way, our culture is already adopting some of these things. Some of them they're not as much as others, but in many ways they are. And so all of it is so entangled and interconnected. It's helpful to think about this in terms of how we form our theology because we're already kind of living it, right?
Absolutely. Well, that should be the goal. Yeah, that should be the goal. So I think the culture is definitely making shifts, making moves towards this much more organic, interrelated universe that we're going to be talking about. But there's still a lot of room to make those transitions still.
Right.
And that's just the nature of ideas. The changing of ideas takes a long time. And when civilizations change in terms of ideology, it often takes a long time. But it's happening. And the sciences help us with that. Philosophy helps with that. Theology and spirituality help us with that in modes of practice.
Yeah.
So it's an exciting time.
It is.
That's for sure.
It's a wild, sometimes I use the word undomesticated. It is an undomesticated time that we live in, which brings chaos, but also potential. So, so it's good.
Yeah.
All right. Well, here's 10 of them. We may get to all of them today. We may not. We may get to more. I don't know. But how about I'll list each one and then I'll just let you riff on it. And we'll see where the dialogue goes. But the first transition is this transition from exception to exemplification. What does that mean? Help us to understand that.
All right. Yes. Well, this is, I think, one of my favorite transitions, really. And these, we should say for viewers too, there's no particular chronological order here that we're sort of going through.
We're non-linear people.
That's right. So this one is so important because, to go back to Whitehead, he critiques the whole development of modern science and philosophy in their stubborn tendency to abstract or to take the human experiential element out of nature. And one way we can think about that is the human experiential element, almost the human existent element, was treated as an exception to, rather than an exemplification of, everything that the world was doing. And so he critiques this tendency because science wants to, approach nature and study it objectively. And that's a laudable goal. That's excellent. And to do so, we methodologically take ourselves out of the picture, and then often forget to put ourselves back in. So the first transition is beautiful because it's Whitehead's reminder that we are an expression of this universe, its nature and its character. We are not an exception to it. We are an exemplification of it. And when we begin to see that, this changes our whole understanding of what this universe is up to. So one metaphor that I like to use is the plant metaphor. So it's not as if we've been dropped into the universe from somewhere else so that we could be totally different from it. Rather, we've grown out of the universe as a plant grows out of soil. And there's an intrinsic connection between a plant and the soil which nurtured its growth. And analogically, I'd say there's an intrinsic connection between who we are as a product of the universe and what this universe is ultimately up to. So I think the significance of this is, assumed in our disciplines in some way, but the implications of it are not really drawn out. For example, we develop a worldview that's based on a reductive understanding of dead insentient matter, right? Without experience, without value, without purpose. Right. And this is the only worldview you can come to if you've completely abstracted the human experiential element out of it. So it's just such an important transition. One statement that Whitehead offers is that we are essentially geography, right? We are as natural as the river, the rain, the trees. We are actually the most intimate side of the world that we know. And he has this great statement where he essentially says, grab your microscope and go in with a microscopic precision. He says, you can't tell me where your body ends and the external world begins, right? So it's this almost mystical fusion with nature, that we're an expression of this universe. There's nothing else that we can be. And what this means for us in terms of belonging to this universe is extremely significant, I would argue, because we've heard a lot of talk about the meaning crisis and different contours of the meaning crisis. And I think one of those is certainly linked to feelings of isolation, feelings of not belonging to this universe, to ourselves, to God, and to others. So I think it's a beautiful transition to mend us back to who and what we are. We're an expression of this universe. We're a part of it and not apart from it. And when we begin to see that, being and longing come together. That's what belonging is, right? We should hold a worldview that allows us to belong. And this transition, I think, helps facilitate that in a significant sense. And then there's implications for God too, right? So Whitehead will also say that God should not be understood as the great exception to the deepest principles of our experience, to the deepest principles of the world. So he says famously that God is the chief exemplification of those ultimate depths of nature. God culminates them and embodies them, and God is not the contradiction to them. And that's also a beautiful statement because it draws a through line from our experience as finite creatures in this universe all the way up to the infinite expression of our experience within the life of God. God is congruent with the world and not contradictory to it. And that, I think, goes into a sense of belonging as well. And the last thing I'll say, I think, is just that if it wasn't the case that we belong here, I don't think we would exist. So the universe has harbored and labored us into being. We are a clue as to the nature of what's going on, and we need to pay attention to that. And that's where philosophy should start. That's where science should start. And arguably theology as well. We can't run from our own experiential shadow, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So we're an expression rather than an exception, rather.
No, that's excellent. I wished I would have remembered to do this in the last couple of days, but I know I did this a couple of months ago. I looked up nature in the dictionary, and even in I can't remember which dictionary I used, but the way it gave the definition made it appear as if it was, I think it said something like everything's separate from humanity or something like that, which of course doesn't make any sense. We have to be a part of nature. We all come from this thing. And I agree with you. That is a healthy place to start our theology. So really good stuff, man.
Yeah, definitely. Let me just follow up on that, because I remember this wonderful tweet. It was in the original presentation. Neil deGrasse Tyson, the very popular astrophysicist. It was sort of a tweet exchange. And then the late comedian Norm Macdonald, I'll just summarize it, but Tyson gets on, presumably in the morning, he tweets to his group, the universe is blind to our sorrows and indifferent by our pains. Have a nice day. It's just sort of, there's a very comforting way to start your day. Right. To which McDonald responds, and I won't remember exactly what he said, but he says, Neil, there's a logic flaw in your little aphorism here, because you've taken yourself out of this situation as if though you were separate or superior to this universe. And then he says, perhaps you forgot, Neil, that we are merely a fraction of this universe. And then he ends it saying, nice day indeed.
Nice day indeed, yes.
So the flaw is that we have this tendency to omit ourselves from our understanding of the world. And so the first transition, I think, is this plea to re-embed ourselves as this exemplification of what the universe is doing. The universe is up to something and not nothing, and we're a part of it. I think that's a very important place to begin thinking about any worldview.
That's great, man. Well, as our friends joining us today can tell, man, we're off and running. We got 9 more to cover. Here's the second one. Well, we'll try to cover. No pressure. I know you like to use a lot of words, and I do as well. So who knows what will get covered here.
I'll try to be brief. Yeah.
No, you're doing fine. This isn't like what's his name, Closer to Truth, or when you were on Robert.
Robert Lawrence Kuhn.
That's a great video, and that was an impressive thing that you did. He was launching.
He really, thank you. He really was. It felt like a dissertation defense. It was almost harder than my dissertation defense. Yeah.
Yeah, so people have to check out that video. Anyhow, here's the second one: from being to becoming.
Excellent. Yes, another fundamental transition. So the first one that we just saw about us being part of nature means that we should attend our experience as offering clues about the nature and character of this world. And arguably, Whitehead, other process and open relational thinkers will say that one of the most fundamental elements of our experience is characterized by becoming, process. Things are bound temporally. They're unfolding and they're becoming. Now, one way to understand open relational theology or process theology at a philosophical level is to say that becoming is more fundamental than being. And there's a beautiful way we can sort of frame this, is that the world is more verb-like than it is noun-like. And there's some important existential implications for that, right? One of them being that it's not the case that we're beings that happen to become. Rather, we're becoming into being at every moment. We're being created and recreated in every single moment. And there's a space here for understanding selfhood or personhood as open rather than closed. And that to me is very significant. That we don't have to be stuck in the repetitions or the fixations of a noun-like world, the fixations of the past. So becoming, starting with becoming as being fundamental, allows us a space to become something more than what we currently are. And I think that's, in addition to being existentially significant, just culturally, at a wider communal level, significant. Because to quote Ian McGilchrist's recent book, which has the playful title of The Matter with Things, right? We don't live in just a world of dead matter and dead things. But these are abstractions. They're pictures taken of the universe, abstracted from a movie-like experiential reality that's really there. So becoming is this process of unfolding, this temporal process that we are participating in. It's absolutely fundamental for our experience, but we often neglect it in our theory. We have a tendency to treat people like it's rather than thous, right? The I-thou distinction that Martin Buber makes. And I think when we think about God too, God has been conceived historically more in terms of being rather than becoming. In fact, God was, as Aquinas said in a fancy way, ipsum esse subsistens, right? The subsistent act of to be itself. God was being, and becoming was utterly neglected, right? And here's another way in which God is the great antithesis, or the great contradiction to our experience. And yet for open relational thinkers, God is fundamental and unchanging in being. God's being, that the fact that God exists doesn't change, but God's experience is fundamentally becoming. God is in relationship to the entire becoming world. And I think this is just very significant too, because we face theological problems. How can God know the world if God is completely unchanging in all respects? Some, like Aristotle, others would say, well, God doesn't, because no change or becoming can be admitted to God, because that would mean divine perfection would be compromised. So I think there's this beautiful corollary in this transition where we get to rethink divine perfection based on divine becoming and not just divine being. There's no reason why perfection demands unchangingness, especially with what we know of the world. Mm-hmm. And the world reflects in part God, if we are to hold on to our first transition too. And it's not all that controversial. It's not a statement of pantheism. It's a statement of general revelation, which the tradition has always said, right? We can learn something of God based upon our reason and our experience in adjudicating and navigating the world. So becoming is not something that is contradictory to God. It's certainly not contradictory to us. We need to think at the level of becoming first, rather than just being, the level of verbs first, a verb-like reality, rather than a noun-like reality. Mm-hmm. So how's that?
That's awesome. I was thinking of, Tom likes to talk about the experience essence binate of God. And that's what I thought of when you were talking about that. So the essence for many open relational thinkers, and certainly for me, is love. And necessarily then, if it's love, the experience is constantly being, compressed and contracted and changed based on all the interactions with our creation. So becoming has to be it. Has to be.
Right. It would be odd if the foundations of reality, which brought us into being, were the opposite of what has been produced. So there's that through line that I'm sort of interested in again. It would make sense to say that God is not changing, becoming better or more perfect in a sense, right? It's a dynamic perfection where relationship, where change is a hallmark of true relatedness or true perfection, rather than a deviation from it. So this is our sort of pushback in the open relational world of these static Greek philosophical principles, which became entrenched in the philosophical worldview, became entrenched in Christian Orthodox thinking.
Exactly.
But Christianity doesn't reveal metaphysical principles per se. We're on the hunt for those throughout the tradition. There's no reason we can't update our metaphysics and re-express our faith from within those. And so doing so in the context of becoming, I think, is very, very fruitful.
Absolutely. It's good stuff, man. All right, moving on. Number 3. Oh, this is a good one. From mechanism to organism.
All right, excellent. Yes, well, okay, where to begin? Perhaps with this, Whitehead called his philosophy the philosophy of organism. Okay, and in part, he is combating a dominant metaphor that emerged in the modern philosophical and scientific worldview. So if we look at the mechanics of Newton, the mechanistic materialistic worldview that developed in modern form through Newton and through Descartes, this is a vision where we really are pictured as machines in a kind of mechanical world. The wonderful thing about Whitehead is he writes right in the midst of this whole mechanical paradigm collapsing. He has great statements. He said, Newton's universe bit by bit slowly sort of crumbles, and what's revealed behind it is just a fluid universe. This much more organic, this much more interrelated and becoming world. But it wasn't just a matter of theory. So he points to the sciences, biological theory, physics, psychology, et cetera, all of which were taking this much more organic turn.
Yeah, let me interrupt you real quick.
Yeah,
wasn't he at one of the presentations with Einstein with respect to the theory of relativity? And so he's literally there watching, as you talk about the old, Newtonian world is crumbling before his eyes in many respects.
Absolutely. Well, and he was in dialogue with Einstein. He wrote a alternative to Einstein's theory of relativity. They had their own squabbles about time and becoming. But absolutely, he says basically, great statement, a personal statement. He says, basically we physicists, we mathematicians were confident that we basically had figured out the universe, right? And he draws this hilarious comment. I won't be able to repeat the whole thing where they were just blown away, right? They everything they thought was settled had crumbled and a whole new universe was emerging. So to label this universe organic, again, it is a metaphor, but it's not a wild metaphor because we are an organic emergence out of this universe. So to begin to think in terms of organism rather than mechanism becomes very important. So what would that look like? Well, in part, we're not dealing in push and pull relations per se at the depths of reality, right? At the level of God is not an external designer that is bringing the world into being from out there and then running off somewhere else. This is the deistic claim, that was sort of prevalent in the 19th century. But we're dealing with real organic evolution where experience is developing. And so at a theological level, I love it because Whitehead offers a certain theological rage against the machine. That's what I like to sort of put it, where God is pictured as being intimately entangled with the world process, where the right understanding is symbiotic. Right? There's a symbiotic connection between God and the world. There are environments that influence that affect each other. And so to be playful, Whitehead, if you're going to be shopping organic for your food, after all, why don't you also shop organic with your philosophy? Right? So he is wanting to bring a worldview up to par with what human experience reveals, with what the sciences reveal. And this shift from mechanism to organism is one way of doing that. And so I guess the last thing I'll say is science and philosophy always deals with metaphors. Theology deals in metaphors, right? We attempt to speak about things that language can't quite grasp. We experience far more than language can grasp. And so again, the organic metaphor is just a metaphor, but it's linked to our experience. And I think it far outweighs this mechanistic understanding. If we treat people mechanically, this is related to treating them as noun-like things too, right? We're at moral faults in that regard. So I think the relatedness that comes from thinking at the level of organism rather than mechanism first can have so many different implications. And I bet you could agree with that in the open relational expression of this too. I mean, would you say so?
Absolutely. And just thinking in terms again of the entanglement of God. Our mutual friend that you're closer to than I am, but Ilia DeLeo, I just read her most recent book. In fact, you're doing a book with her, aren't you? Coming out sometime soon?
That's right. We just signed a contract with Orbis Books for a book on Whitehead and Teilhard. It's going to be an excellent book.
Yeah. That's going to be fun. Anyhow, I just read her most recent, and sorry, the name's escaping me, the book, but
the Not Yet God.
There you go. Exactly. But the divine entanglement that, she talks about a lot in there. And I'm sure other people have used that phrase as well, but that's what I'm thinking of a lot here. And just my approach to the divine now is just quite a bit different. Actually, there's a lot of similarity to the way it used to be because I intuited some of this. I think a lot of us do. I just didn't have the language for it. I just didn't realize I was actually allowed to think in this way. So it's fun that my theology matches up with what I'm intuiting.
It's a really great point. Yeah, because often folks who discover open relational process thinking say, I intuited this as the way things might be in some sense, but what I've been given now is the conceptual base for this, the way of expressing that. So, and I think that's thoroughly consistent with this emphasis on human experience. But I know we'll get to that more as we continue on here.
Excellent. All right, number 4. Holy cow, we're only at number 4. From independence to mutual imminence. I feel like we should have really nice, epic music behind each one of these, but I'm not going to do it. I've sworn it off. This can be us.
No problem. That's okay. This too is a very important, one of my favorite transitions, right? From independence to mutual imminence. So let's go back to one of Whitehead's principal critiques again of the philosophical, scientific, and theological tradition. He says that they've essentially been obsessed with categories of independence, isolation, in non-relation. So at one point, he even says that this is the great misconception of all of philosophy, that we've sort of pedestalized these notions of independence, isolation, and non-relation. We made them orthodox in modern philosophy. And it's no wonder that we see the world as made of independent dead pellets of matter that are only externally related. Right? There's that sort of, again, that mechanistic sort of notion. So one way I like to be playful with respect to this discussion is by harping on poor René Descartes, right? The father of modern philosophy. So Descartes defined a substance. That's a fancy philosophical term, that which stands under, right? It's an ancient term in many ways. But his modern definition of a substance out of which all of the world is made, he defined as an existing thing which requires nothing but itself in order to exist. And so this is what I like to playfully call Descartes' nothing but syndrome, right? And it's a syndrome that, he sort of highlighted, turned the volume up on it quite a bit in the modern world. It was there in the tradition. But it's one that we again face today, right? We see ourselves as nothing but ourselves. It's one that banishes relationality. It's one that banishes this deep relatedness that we sort of have been talking about. And Whitehead says it's this final sort of conclusion of independence that I'm rejecting. Right? So in its place, he says the world must be seen in terms of interwovenness, of that deep relationality. And one way in which he labels that is through this language of mutual imminence. And all that means is that who we are is utterly woven and independent with everything else, right? That there's a mutuality among our relationships, of our coming and going. It's almost this Buddhist notion, right, of pratitya samuppada, the dependent origination of all things in their coming and going. And again, you can see the practical implications of this, because if we treat others as just independent silos, we treat our disciplines as independent silos, countries as independent silos, requiring nothing but themselves in order to exist, we're back in that sort of mechanical frame again. And we've also had a nothing but God, right? God was pictured as the supreme expression of nothing but existence, ultimately independent, ultimately isolated, ultimately unrelated to the world. And so this transition is to collapse all that as much as the Newtonian collapse, right? To re-embed our relatedness into our theory. And this includes God as well, such that Whitehead will say that there is no being, not even God himself, that requires nothing but himself in order to exist, right? So it's a sort of beautiful expression of that. We're not independent statues, where we have roots, because we're organisms that go deep down behind us into nature and all the way above us into God, as it were. So, I mean, maybe you'll want to say more about that in your own life, but it's a fundamental transition, and it's related to everything that's gone before us in this conversation too.
Well, the thought occurs to me, it's called open and relational theology. So
there it is.
The relational piece, you have to have this. And you're absolutely right. The nothing but piece, this whole idea that for some reason God is better or stronger or more powerful or more whatever, because he or she doesn't need, well, it's he in that tradition, doesn't need anything else or is completely separate. First of all, it's such an abstract thing to try to think of complete separateness that it's almost pointless at some level too. Sure. And the other thing I was going to say, the other thing is, as you know, I mean, I'm into Girard, and that was a big helpful thing for me in my development of my theology, but also psychology. And so, I don't know if he coined this word, but I think he did, the word interdividual versus individual. And so this idea of individuality is really nice and fits very well with what you're saying. Yeah.
I like that a lot. Yeah. Raymond Panikkar had a similar kind of phrasing. What was it? Something along those lines. I forget. Yeah. I like to call it independent inseparability. Right. So a worldview that allows us to be individuals. The world's individuating all the time, but it does so out of a cauldron of relationships. And Absolutely. The relationships are what is primary, not the relata, not that which is related. The relationships are fundamental. So yeah, I just think it's such a profound shift for us.
Absolutely. All right. How about this one? Oh, my word. They just keep getting better and better. From force to persuasion.
Okay. Yes. Awesome. This one is deep and abiding. Well, again, I get a lot of these transitions from Whitehead, so it makes sense to start with him as being one of the most, I would say, harsh and voracious critics of force, of coercion, of this barbaric kind of preoccupation with power and omnipotence on both a human and a sort of divine level. So in one statement, he'll say that the recourse to force is a disclosure of the failure of civilization. Right? When our societies, when civilization, when we have a recourse to push and pull violence and force, there's failures going on in our thinking, failures going on in our acting. And now, Whitehead, in addition to being a great admirer of theology, a great appreciator of the contributions of religion, was also a harsh critic. So he'll talk about what he calls the tragic history of Christianity, which initially was presented with this persuasive power as expressed in the life of Christ, and yet forgot about that in its construction of God. As the theology developed, we gave up persuasion and we opted for barbaric kinds of coercive power, coercive kinds of omnipotence. And of course, there's a deeper strain to this transition too, because Whitehead was a great admirer of Plato. If anybody's read Plato, Whitehead's famous statement says, the whole history of European philosophy is but a footnote to Plato. And one of the great things he says in this regard is that Plato made what he says is the most important intellectual discovery in the history of religion. That's quite an interesting claim. And what was that discovery? It was that the divine element should be understood as a persuasive agency and not as a coercive agency. That persuasion is the mechanism of creation. We're persuaded into ideals and possibilities. We're not pushed into them through coercive power. So it's in the early Platonic world, this emphasis on persuasion, but just a theory, the theory of persuasion. The next step Whitehead makes is to say that what we see in the life of Christ is the supreme expression of that which Plato only intellectually discerned. We see it practiced in the life of Christ. And what is it? It's that persuasive love that was expressed in the founder of our faith. And so it's just such an important transition. And Whitehead, in the deep sense, is calling us back to understanding divine power as persuasion. It's not weakness. It's that power that is consistent with the nature of God as goodness, of beauty, as love, as Tom Ord would tell us. And the last thing I'll say is be on the lookout for a great text, hopefully this year. And the title of that is From Force to Persuasion, Process Relational Perspectives on Power and the God of Love, where we're sort of situating this shift back to persuasion in the context of theology, politics, spirituality, religion. Let me say one last thing on this transition. Why should we think of divine power as the power of Hitler and not Mother Teresa? It's like this coercive power, which involves push and pull, a tug of war match, interventions from some exterior place, rather than that evocative, inward, persuasive power. And it does a lot for the problem of evil too, because open relational thinkers are saying this is God's modus operandi. It's God's way of acting, and that God, in fact, can't use the kind of barbaric power that would exclude love from God's nature. God is governed by love, and divine power flows from the divine love. Therefore, divine power is necessarily persuasive. Whitehead didn't put it quite that way, but that's a spin on it.
Yeah. Oh my word. Well, there's so many great things. I feel like we should take an offering. This is so good. I have an altar call or something right here. But this has been so important for me. Of course, my little dissertation was called Theology of Consent. I did not set out. That word was not really in my vernacular that much. It's slightly embarrassing now, but consent became such a important piece. And I remember one day contemplating and thinking about Mother Mary and the whole passage and how important that story is. And it's just a couple little words, but she says, let it be unto me, whatever that paraphrase is. The whole idea is she is consenting to this thing. God is not doing this thing to her. Because how horrible would that story be if that were the case? And
Sure.
so then I was thinking, oh my word, maybe the entire cosmos revolves around the idea of this consent and this persuasive power. I just think that's so beautiful.
I love that. And one way we can also express that, this is a call and response universe. The persuasion is a call. It's a call to be something more than you currently are, but it demands your response, right? And so we're able to respond to the divine call. God doesn't force us into corners. God presents the possibility for you and awaits your response. Love does that. Love doesn't force. Love is patient. Love offers. Love abides, and love waits. That shouldn't we conceive God in that way? And at our best, shouldn't we be that way with our friends, our loved ones, our nations? As hard as that is, especially now.
Well, it seems like it's written somewhere in a very esteemed text that love is patient.
Yes. What was that text? Absolutely. Absolutely.
It's untenable to put love is patient with God is going to run out of patience at some point and fix everything. It just doesn't make sense.
That patience might even give us a sense of why 13 billion years have been unfolding very slowly, so that something like us, and perhaps many others, based on my recent work, have been brought into being. Patience is a theological category that needs to be explored much, much more. Yeah. And you can do it in the science-religion dialogue. That would be interesting.
Yeah, that's really cool. All right, we could do a whole episode on that one. This Definitely. One is from dogmatism to dynamism. I always struggle with dynamism.
Yeah. Well, okay. So let's start with Whitehead again, where Whitehead, I think, again, in addition to being one of the most vicious critics of power, this previous transition, Whitehead is also a vicious critic of dogmatism as it develops across our disciplines, okay, science, philosophy, religion. None of these disciplines are immune to it. So what is dogmatism? Well, at least in part, it's this exaggeration of the finality of our current states of thinking, right? We see this philosophically. We see this politically. We see it certainly theologically, our obsession with certain doctrines. Whitehead has a beautiful statement where he says, religions commit suicide when they find their inspiration in their dogmas. So there's this beautiful, I think, transition that is from this dogmatic tendency, our holding of our doctrines, our holding of our ideas very tightly, to opening our hands a bit from being dogmatic to dynamic. So what, in part, I think what it would mean to be dynamic with our ideas is to hold them open, to let them be flexible. A dynamic idea is one that is open to being changed if evidence should require it, open to even being rejected if that needs to happen. So I think we need to practice dynamism with our ideas, even politically, right? We look at this political division we're facing, where there's so much dogmatism, clashing, and clamoring, and just a terrible division. We need to be more open about that, I think. Hear the other side, be dynamic, be willing to change. And is it, like, if you think of the role of God in this one, again, we've sort of kind of been moving from Whitehead to the existential dimension in these transitions to thinking theologically too. Is God really about the preservation of certain dogmas? Right? Does God want us, as it were, to be dogmatic with respect to doctrines? Is doctrines what theology is about, what religion is about? I would submit not at all. In fact, Whitehead, even in one place, suggests that God is mischievous, right? God is that element in the nature of things which calls you past your stagnations in terms of your doctrines, your life, etc. God wants to disturb our complacency to bring us to a place that we don't necessarily want to go, right? It's this beautiful sort of element of the story of Abraham. Take up your things and go to this place that I'm going to show you. Well, where is it? Where am I supposed to go? Just go. I'm going to show you. So I think a dynamic God is one that we need to be ready for, because it's going to be one that's going to disturb our stasis, call us into something more, allow for ideas to be flexible and to change. But naturally, people don't like that. they remain dogmatists. So this is a fault of the traditions, and I think Christian faith certainly has struggled with it. Let us be more dynamic rather than dogmatic. That's what this transition is about.
Yeah, it's so true. A built-in problem, though, so a question I have is, of course, you have to try to figure out how to order your world. And one of the ways we order our worlds is, well, for example, in your world and my world, we write. So we put words on a page that can easily become dogmatic. And so how do we avoid, even as we're putting words on a page,
Sure. I think we have to also inject into those pages humility.
Right.
You know, Whitehead says the merest hint of dogmatic certainty in philosophic discussion is an exhibition of folly.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so I hope when I write, I'm working on a Whitehead book now, I'm trying to write with humility. Things are not utterly settled. And when people think they are, that's when you can launch into a place of dogmatism and utter certainty.
You know what's interesting is the day and age we live in, you know, we can literally update a text and within hours on Amazon or Barnes & Noble or wherever, and we could, which is fascinating. You could get stuck with constantly, you know, not landing on something, but also that's kind of cool. So we have that ability to edit our stuff on the fly.
Indeed.
I like it.
Yeah.
I like it.
Not so much on recorded podcasts, though.
This is true. This is true. Although maybe AI in the near future will probably help us. Probably help us.
Maybe indeed.
All right. How about if you didn't think they were good so far, how about from passivity to creativity?
Awesome. Yes. Good. Okay. Well, perhaps alongside the great French philosopher, Henri Bergson, who's another process open kind of thinker. Whitehead gives this creativity, that word, a fundamental philosophic meaning, a fundamental importance, I think, for the philosophical tradition that's really, really unmatched, almost single-handedly. So creativity for him represents this restless becoming, right? Creativity, if we want to hark back to another transition, is what makes it the case in the universe that becoming is more fundamental than being. So we are expressions of creativity. Every entity is an expression of creativity, but also has a role of agency. We shape the creativity in the universe in personal ways. It is a part of us, but it also transcends us. So one thing I think that I emphasized in the original presentation, you can't say that I'm not creative in Whitehead's universe. In an open and relational universe, you're not only a product of a creativity that transcends you, this creativity of the cosmos, but that creativity should be expressed through you. And you have this ability to funnel it, to canalize it, to do things with it as a source for meaning. I think you agree. Music, art, dance, any domain of expression has to do with creativity. And when we're passive, passivity spells death. When we see a culture that's passive, it's in decline. So I think there's something beautiful about creativity breathing life back into the universe. And at least for Whitehead's world, we're agents of that creativity. Now, if we jump to the level of God beyond us, God too is this primordial expression of creativity in the universe. God is what gives creativity a character in the cosmos and gives that to us so that we can then channel it through our own agency or our own creativity. So I think creativity in theology is essential. I don't think that theology is about finding out what's true and just stating it boldly. I think it's about finding the truth and expressing it in the most creative way possible. We need creativity in our theology. And doing so would help us be less dogmatic, again, to see the ways in which these transitions are intersected. But you're a pretty creative guy, Jonathan. I know that about you.
Well, I don't know about that, but I'm definitely interested in it and I'm intrigued in it. And I realized years ago, even though I've spent most of my life pastoring, that really at heart, I'm an artist. And one of the things that I realized as an artist that I loved was, let's just say in the world of music, but is tension. I loved suspended chords, and I loved inharmonics and sevenths and ninths, and the songs that were always just like this 1-3-5 chord, 3 or 4 chords, just get really boring quick. And so I literally, I remember being in my late 20s when I was first pastoring, early 30s, I literally would sit and think about the tension of music and what I enjoyed. And then I would try to overlay that into my theology, which, my vernacular is still limited and my brain's still limited, but it definitely was then too. And that was really helpful for me, because then I was like, now I get it. Like, there's not one particular way this has to go. And there's something that's really beautiful that's happening in the midst of my life and in the life of this church, maybe, or in the life of these people I'm working with. So yeah, this creativity thing means a lot to me.
Yeah. Oh, I think it's deep and abiding for me too. And when we begin to see that God is a creative agent as well, right? So this creatio continua, continuous creation, which is an important part of the theological tradition, right? So that creation is not a one and done event of the past. It's not behind us. It's present. It's now. It's up ahead. Creativity is ongoing. Co-creativity is ongoing. So Whitehead will push back at the tradition, saying it faults to the extent that it thinks that God is the only source of creativity in the universe. God's role is the creation of co-creators, the creation of self-creators that also bring their own novelty, their own creativity into being. And so it's a beautiful vision of that. And the various domains of creativity you were mentioning, art, pastoring, preaching, etc. Creativity pervades our life. So let us not be passive. Let us adopt a stance of creativity. And there's many ways to do that, I think.
You know what else? I had never really thought about it this way until a couple of years ago, but watching some video of probably Hawaiian Islands, but the islands literally still forming, the fire and the water. And I'm like, it hit me in a new way, like, oh, wait, that's creation. That's
right.
Not what God did in a 7-day period, whatever. It's literally kind of in
way back when.
Right. We're kind of in this seventh, so to speak, right? Is that a way to look at it? We're in the seventh day kind of thing where we're co-creating with God, and it's literally happening underneath our feet. That's the reality.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's not as if Scripture doesn't support this, right? I mean, not a literal reading of Scripture. But for example, let us bring into being mankind, right? Who is the us in that question? And now there's a lot of, interpretations of that. I like to think of it as God in nature, God in what has been brought into being thus far, now collaborating creatively to bring in a new being such as ourselves. So there's definitely room for reading this creativity in Scripture and certainly beyond it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. All right. Number 8, from decadence to adventure.
All right. Excellent. Well, you can see how these are, intertwined.
All interconnected. Yes. Yeah.
Totally. Well, where to begin? Whitehead was a great fan of adventure. He thought that without adventure, civilization dies. And if I could recommend a book to you, perhaps you've read it, I'm sure you have for your text, but certainly to your listeners, read his book, Adventures of Ideas. So this is his philosophy of civilization. In many ways, it's a very readable book. But one of the things he says in there is that, what does he say? He says, advance or decadence are our only options, right? And decadence, right, is this comfort, this stasis. We're content with what we've accomplished thus far. We're just going to enjoy and relax now. And he says that spells the slow death of a civilization, right? So this unrest that needs to be a part of our civilizations, even individually, right? This adventurous element that has to be there. And we either keep advancing or we remain static and we begin to die. And again, we see examples of this, I think, all throughout our culture. We have excessive, especially in the West, luxury, excessive comfort. We've become decadent. And I would argue with a lot of people that our society has not become better, right? So we have to keep that creative element alive. That creative element contributes to this element of adventure, of keeping the possible alive, what still can be. And I think if you think about this with respect to God. Again, what is God's aim in creation? Let's create a world that I know which world I'm going to create. I'm going to know what's going to happen in the future. Everything's settled. This is not an adventurous picture. And what modern cosmology will tell us, if anyone is listening, is that this is an adventurous exploratory cosmos. And that we, as expressions of it, have to keep that adventure going in and through our lives, through art, through creativity, etc. But there's a more beautiful vision, too, that God is found in the adventure and not opposed to it. God's role is not to keep you satisfied. God is calling you to something like Abraham again. Go to this place that I'm going to show you. I don't know what that place is. You're right. We're going to find out together. This is an adventure that we're both on. So at least in that book, Adventures of Ideas, Whitehead moves away from using the language of God. Instead, he'll speak of the adventure of the universe as one, right? The unity of the universe, or it's just simply God is the supreme adventure. So it's this beautiful vision of an adventurous God leading a world to ends we know not what. We don't know. But there's a faithfulness in adventure too, a companion in your adventure. And Whitehead uses that language of God too. God's a part of the adventure. And would we want it any other way than that? I don't know. What do you think?
I don't think we would. I think it's so funny. Each one of these, I'm like, oh my word, this is so sneaking important. So I'll just share a personal anecdote, a little thing. A couple of months ago, I was working on this really important project to me. And I put everything into it that I could. And I'm really proud of the way it turned out. It didn't turn into a world-changing kind of thing that I'd hoped. And I'm saying that slightly tongue in cheek. But I mean, I do have a lot of hubris, so I can say that. And I remember just being really disappointed about it one day. And as I'm thinking about it, I had this sense, like I wasn't even really praying. I wasn't thinking about praying in that moment. But all of a sudden, I kind of had this sense of like, I had this little dialogue, which I think was probably with the divine, or it might have been myself. I don't know. But the idea was, it's too bad it didn't turn out like this, but maybe we'll go this direction. And maybe it could still become something. And I remember in that moment thinking how grateful I am, and if I can use what we're talking about now, that I'm interacting with an adventurous God, because in my old theology, what I would have thought was, this just wasn't meant to be. God didn't want this to happen. I can't become this thing because God's put a ceiling on it. Right. But that's not reality. And I was just in that moment, it kind of, a bunch of stuff clicked with me, and I was thinking about ORT, open relational theology, and how grateful I am that, oh no, this is not the end of the story. And that God might have been disappointed that it wasn't a world-changing thing too, but that doesn't mean that it might not be in the future, or who knows what it'll turn into, because the whole thing is an adventure. Yeah.
Jonathan, it's good news. There's no ceiling. Right. That's one way to express the open in open and relational theology. Right. There's no ceiling that you're running into. God's not a fan of ceilings. God is what opens the ceiling.
Right.
So I agree. That's beautiful, man.
And because God is patient. And so we'll find another way to go. So it means a lot to me. It's so great. All right. We're doing good, man. We got two more. Let's knock them out. Great. From pessimism to possibility.
Oh yeah. Great.
Very similar, but
this is one of my favorites. But the whole backdrop of this entire discussion, all these different transitions, is this firm affirmation of possibility as something real. Possibilities are fascinating because they're not actual, but they exist. Right? They're real, but they're not actual. To have a process of worlds, right? Whitehead says as soon as you admit a process of universe, you have to deal with this category of possibility, because what is happening in that universe? New possibilities are being actualized. Novelties being actualized. And where are those possibilities? Where do they come from? Right? If a radical novel possibility is actualized, that's not inherent to the past. Where does it come from? It's like it comes from up ahead, right? It's this futurity that's meeting the present in each moment. So I guess what I want to express in this transition is this, especially in our dominant culture, we are utterly pessimistic. right? Pessimistic about the future as simply being no different from the past or the present, right? We're scared of that in upcoming elections, in our own personal lives, et cetera. We're incredibly, I think, pessimistic about things in a way that I've never seen in my lifetime. And I know you're a little bit older than me, but probably not too much older. But we worry about the possibilities of the future. There's a sense in which what may be ahead is frightening because it could be terrible in some way. There's live and weighty possibilities up ahead of us. And this is, I think, really presupposed in this open, there it is, an open and relational universe, that the future is open. And what is the future but a domain of possibilities? So pessimism, I think, has to do with our mistrust in what is possible for us, the limitation of what is possible. Pessimism, I would say, becomes despair-like when possibilities are so limited in our experience that we can see no other options, right? And so I think of Kierkegaard, who, says, what we're crying out for is possibility. Possibility is the only salvation, in some sense. And if we connect this to a theological discussion, God, for Whitehead, is present in the mode of an always arriving possibility, a salvific mode. God saves the world in each moment by confronting the closure of actuality with something still possible. Right? It confronts the potential death of the moment with that moment living on through another mode of possibility. And so you've known Whitehead's famous statement. He says, God does not create the world. God saves the world. Or rather, God is the poet of the world with tender patience, leading it by his vision of truth, beauty, and goodness. And this connects again to this creativity we've been talking about. God doesn't create the world if we understand that to be one omnipotent boom. There it is. God saves the world because God gives the world the possibility of its own creation. And so talking about this futurity is important because if the future is different from the past, it's because God is providing new possibilities for us to become other than what we were. And so I think it's a beautiful transition because we face these pessimistic times, but there are possibilities ahead of us that we don't know, but that are arguably being arranged in such a way so that they can be actualized. God saves the world from closing in upon itself. And one might look at the status of the world now and say, we need some sort of salvation, right? We need new possibility. So Whitehead is concerned here with soteriology in the mode of possibility, and not just protology, not just creation with an omnipotent boom. We need salvation in some way. Yeah. But that's a heavy term, I know.
Yes, it's a loaded term. Well, I couldn't help but think, as you're talking, there's a bunch of stuff, but well, and first I should say I'm really thankful for a lot of the religious tradition that I have. So it wasn't all bad. There's a lot of good stuff to it. But I think one of the areas where it's really done us a disservice is this idea that the world is, it's inevitable and inexorably going towards this cataclysmic, violent, apocalyptic ending, and that somehow that's going to demonstrate to the world that God is who God is or whatever. It's once you start thinking in terms of possibility and open-endedness and relationship and creativity and adventure, you're like, that's absurd. Yeah. It's put us in a terrible, terrible position, right?
Yeah, absolutely. In all across our disciplines too, right? So we have notions of the secular apocalypse, not just the theological apocalypse, absolutely. Right? Which can be incredibly, incredibly damaging, as worrying as they are in some sense, right?
Right. The possibility is real. So that I'm not saying that might not happen, but that it has to happen in order to prove anything about God is nauseating.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, no, I agree. This is a challenging time that we're living through.
Yeah. Preach it, man. All right. Well, here's the last one. I know you like this one. From solitude to divine world loyalty.
Nice. Yes, cool. All right. Well, Whitehead had a beautiful little book called Religion in the Making, excuse me. It's slim, but it's powerful. And it's his sort of look at the evolution of religion across history, and then later his sort of metaphysical musings. Excellent text. Anyway, one of the main concepts that he employs in that book is this notion of solitude as being essential and a part of religion. In fact, he even says it belongs to the religious spirit to feel forsaken, to be solitary. He even says if you're never solitary, you're never religious, right? It's like this phase of religion, this evolution of religion where we confront the fact that we are alone, that we're individuals in this universe. But of course, there's another rendering of that just in dominant culture. It's sort of related to this thing like vision of the world. We're just solitary individuals, and well, that's it, you know. But as he speaks about the evolution of religion, he says there's this question that a person in their solitude asks, something along the lines of, you know, what in the attainment of value is the purpose of life, of what I should be doing? And then he says there's no way to answer that question without merging the solitary individual with the world itself. Right? So there's this beautiful connection or movement from the individual to what he calls the religion as world loyalty. Right? So that this movement from ourselves out to domains beyond ourselves, and that this domain beyond ourselves, this loyalty to the world, which arguably we need today, is the utmost part of religious sort of allegiance. Now, if God is not loyal to the world, we have good reason not to be loyal to the world either, right? So there's certainly portraits of God. You just mentioned in your previous comment, right? The apocalyptic scenario where God brings this world to an apocalyptic end, and that's it, right? So the whole saga of the Left Behind series, right, are sort of based in this this idea that, well, you know, we don't want to be here, you know, we should go somewhere else, somewhere better. But so I think Whitehead gives us a vision of God's, again, entanglement, God's loyalty to the world. And if God's loyal to the world, how can we afford not to be? Of course, what that looks like is challenging. It would require loyalty to self, loyalty to family, loyalty to friends. Loyalty is an important part of existence, and as well as loyalty to God. But I think it's important to see that loyalty to God, it cannot be done without loyalty to neighbor, loyalty to world, right? It's this sort of deeply Christian refrain that we have to love our neighbor as ourselves, and love ourselves as well as the precondition of that. A healthy love, it's not a cocky thing, but we should be a friend to ourselves, remain loyal to who we are and who we know we can be. So solitude belongs. All of us feel solitude. But in our solitude, let us not forget about the world. And let's not forget the fact that God, too, is loyal to this world. And I used the language of companionship in the transition or two ago. But one of my favorite statements of Whitehead is that God is the great companion, the fellow sufferer who understands. And what is that but an expression of loyalty, right? A mutual loyalty, suffering with. So yeah, I mean, we could say a lot about that, I'm sure, but this mutual loyalty, moving from solitude to divine world loyalty. There's so much to say. I struggle with the word loyalty, and recently in my life, I decided that I like the word faithful better than loyal. Loyal has this connotation of kind of just being blind and doing whatever anyone says. Faithful seems a deeper thing to me, like trying to get to the heart and the essence of the thing. So I struggle with that, but I do love the world. I do love the world loyalty, and I think it's so much fun to see how all of these things in a Venn diagram kind of a way, they just overlap again and again. It's cool. Well, and you asked me in the beginning, I've thought of doing a book on these transitions, which would be fun to write. I get some time, and before I would begin, I would have a Venn diagram that shows how they're all interconnected. And again, we could have started with this one and ended with human beings as so there's no chronology, but I do think they're significant. There's more we could add. For example, if I would add another one, it would be something along the lines of from vacuousness to value, or something like that, right? Because there's this whole critique of the division between fact and value. They're just dead, inert stuff. But value becomes this utterly pervasive notion of human experience. So there's more transitions we can add to these 10. There's not just 10, but I hope whoever's listening, right, will get you started in thinking about how Whitehead's thinking, but not just Whitehead, open relational thinking can really transition how we think and how we live. And as we began, right, as we think we live, we don't just, as Socrates said, we don't just sort of live our life without examining it. We shouldn't examine it without living it. We need both of these things, and ideas come into play there in a big way. So it's been fun, Jonathan.
Yeah, it has been. And I think it's going to be helpful for all the tens and tens of people that listen to my podcast. It's going to be awesome.
Yeah, that's good. I hope so.
I think most importantly, if you were in an MMA ring with Matt Siegel, who is going to come out on top? Who's going to win that fight?
Oh my gosh, Matt's a real good friend. And Matt and I are collaborating, Center for Process Studies and the California Institute for Integral Studies for an upcoming conference on Ian McGilchrist. So, to all listening, go to the Center for Process website, Process Studies, and register. It's going to be a great event. There's online space. Matt's a great ally. Matt has a tremendous intellect.
Yeah, he does.
And anyone should be ready and prepared if they're going to be going up and debating with Matt. We have our squabbles here and there, but there's much that we agree on. So I would hope that we end up shaking hands after at least having a beer or something. But no, Matt's a great friend, and I really encourage everybody to listen to his work.
Nah, he's great too, man. All right, Andrew. Well, thanks so much. Best place to find you. Where would people go? YouTube? Yep. Andrew M. Davis?
AndrewMDavis.info. I keep that updated.
That's right.
Please subscribe, if you will, to the YouTube channel, and which I also keep updated. Or send me questions. I love to keep the conversation going. You can access that through my website. So
love it.
Let's keep the conversation going.
You going to be able to come to OrtCon this summer?
That is still pending. I hope so. Yeah, I really hope so. There's a lot going on. I'll be Munich and Star Island and Manchester. So it's like there's a lot happening. So I'm trying to figure out the schedule now.
Yeah.
So
cool, man. Well, thanks for hanging out. I appreciate it. And
thank you, my friend.
We'll talk
Take
soon.
care. Okay.